In the back streets of Britain, where loyalty is tested with blood and power is measured in fear, live men who redefine toughness. These are not the gangsters from Hollywood films. They're real, breathing legends of violence and survival. Every scar on their body tells a story. Every stare, a warning. They've ruled prisons like kingdoms, turned neighborhoods into empires, and earned a respect that no law could ever give. But what makes a man truly tough in a world where one mistake can end your life? Behind every headline and whispered legend lies a darker truth of broken bones, shattered trust, and souls hardened by endless war. From the underground fight pits of Manchester to the grim cells of London's most dangerous prisons, these men carved their names into history, not with glory, but with pain. Some became feared, some became myths. All of them paid a price. Tonight, we lift the veil on the brutal reality of Britain's toughest men, the power they wielded, the fear they inspired, and the violence that defined them. This isn't just a story about crime, it's a story about survival. In a world where only the ruthless endure, Britain's streets have always had two sides, the one you see in daylight and the one that comes alive when the sun goes down. In that hidden world, rules are rewritten. Respect isn't earned through kindness or charm. It's earned through pain, power, and the ability to survive when no one else can. This is where Britain's toughest men were born. They didn't grow up wanting to be feared. Most came from poverty, broken homes, and violent neighborhoods that taught them only one truth. You either become a victim or a survivor. From early fights in council estates to brutal prison brawls, they learned that the world respects only one thing: strength. Over the years, these men built reputations that spread across cities and even into prisons. They became legends of the underground, enforcers, fighters, and men whose names alone could silence a room. But behind every story of dominance lies a darker reality: loneliness, betrayal, and a lifetime of blood. This documentary pulls back the curtain on that world, exposing the lives of men who built their power from fear. From bare-knuckle champions and gang enforcers to prison warlords and street kings, we uncover the truth about who they were, how they rose, and what it truly costs to be Britain's toughest man. Every legend in Britain's criminal underworld begins the same way: in poverty, chaos, and violence. These men weren't born ruthless. They were shaped by their environment. In the rough council estates of London, Manchester, and Glasgow, life was a constant test of survival. Growing up in these places meant learning fast, because weakness was an open invitation to pain. For kids in these areas, school offered no protection. The real lessons were taught in alleyways and on street corners. Fists did the talking, and respect was something you fought for, not something freely given. The first time you got punched and didn't fall, that was the moment you were noticed. That was the moment the streets started to respect you. Take the story of Liam Steele Carter, born in the East End of London. His father was a boxer, his mother addicted to heroin. By the age of 10, Liam was already defending himself against older kids who saw him as easy prey. He learned to fight with precision, coldness, and no fear. By 16, he was working for a local debt collector, not because he wanted to, but because it paid and kept him safe. Violence became his way of life. Across Britain, similar stories echoed. In Manchester, young men like Reese Razor Nolan made names for themselves in illegal fight clubs. The crowds would roar as these boys battered each other for a few quid and some respect. Each fight hardened them, not just physically, but mentally. Pain became normal. Fear disappeared. By their early 20s, many of these boys were no longer just fighters. They were local legends. Their names carried weight in their neighborhoods. When they walked into pubs, people moved aside. When they spoke, others listened. It wasn't fame. It was fear. a powerful kind of respect that few could earn. But with power came responsibility and danger. Every street had challengers, every gang had rivals. To stay on top, these men had to constantly prove themselves. One wrong move, one sign of weakness, and someone would take everything. This constant tension built a mindset: trust no one, show no fear, and strike first if needed. Over time, their identity became inseparable from their toughness. They couldn't back down, even when they wanted to. Their pride, their name, their reputation, it all depended on the myth of being the hardest man around. The pressure to live up to that image turned many into monsters. Liam Carter once said in an interview years later, "When you grow up in violence, you start thinking that's all life is. You don't even realize how deep you've gone until there's no way back." That was the tragedy of Britain's toughest men. Behind every act of power, there was pain. Behind every fearless face, a broken past. They didn't chase danger for glory. They did it because danger was all they ever knew. By the time they reached adulthood, the transformation was complete. The streets had done their job, turned scared little boys into men feared by everyone around them. The underworld now had new soldiers, and Britain had new names that would soon echo through its prisons, pubs, and newspapers. Men who were about to turn survival into a legacy of violence. Once a man earned his reputation on the streets, he was no longer just a fighter. He became part of something bigger. In Britain's criminal underworld, power didn't come from one man alone. It came from the Brotherhood, a network of men bound by loyalty, respect, and fear. These groups weren't ordinary gangs. They were small armies ruled by their own codes. There were no written rules, no contracts. Everything was built on trust, and the understanding that betrayal meant death. Inside this world, loyalty was sacred. A man's word was his bond, and breaking it could start a war. These brotherhoods controlled everything from debt collection and protection rackets to illegal betting and underground fighting. Each man had his role: the enforcer, the muscle, the negotiator, the silent watcher. In the back alleys of London and the smoky pubs of Glasgow, deals were made in whispers. Rival crews would meet under the pretense of peace, but everyone knew violence could erupt at any moment. Respect was the only thing keeping the balance. You didn't look another hard man in the eye unless you were ready to prove yourself. One such brotherhood ruled Manchester for years, led by a man known only as Big Tommy Clark. A former bare-knuckle boxing champion, Tommy was built like a tank and had a presence that could silence a room. He wasn't loud or reckless. He didn't need to be. People obeyed him because they knew what he was capable of. His crew controlled half the city's underground trade, not because they had guns, but because everyone feared the consequences of crossing them. Inside this brotherhood, violence wasn't random. It was calculated. Beatings weren't punishments. They were messages. When someone didn't pay up, they wouldn't just be hurt. They'd be humiliated, made an example of. Fear was a language, and these men spoke it fluently. But this kind of power came with paranoia. Trust was rare, betrayal common. A man could be your brother one night and your enemy the next. That's why these crews operated like families, eating together, fighting together, and protecting each other like blood. Some even took loyalty to the grave. Tommy Clark once said, "You can't buy loyalty. You earn it by making sure the man next to you fears letting you down more than he fears dying." It was brutal logic, but it worked. For years, his crew stayed untouchable. However, power built on fear always carries cracks. Rival groups from Liverpool and Birmingham began testing boundaries, moving in on their territories. What started as street arguments quickly turned into all-out turf wars. Cars were set on fire, houses shot up, and men disappeared overnight. Each act of violence demanded another in return. Soon, the Brotherhood wasn't fighting for power. It was fighting for survival. The loyalty that once held them together now became a burden. Friends turned on each other. Old alliances fell apart. And as police pressure mounted, the same fear that built the Brotherhood began tearing it apart. For Britain's toughest men, these years would define their legends. The Brotherhood gave them strength, protection, and purpose. But it also chained them to a life where peace was weakness and trust was a death sentence. They lived by one code. Fear keeps you alive, loyalty keeps you powerful. But in the end, that same code would drag them deeper into the darkness, a place where only the most ruthless could survive. For Britain's toughest men, prison wasn't a punishment. It was a test. A brutal arena where reputations were either made or destroyed. Once inside, there were no friends, no mercy, and no way to hide. The same men who ruled the streets now found themselves surrounded by killers, lifers, and monsters just like them. It was survival in its purest form. One mistake could cost you your life. From London's HMP Belmarsh to Manchester's Strangeways, these prisons became battlegrounds where respect was the only currency. The guards controlled the keys, but the inmates controlled the order. Every wing had its own pecking order. The strong ruled, the weak obeyed, and everyone watched their back. When a new inmate arrived, his first few days determined everything. If you looked soft, you were finished. If you stood your ground, people took notice. Fights broke out over nothing. A look, a word, a piece of bread. And the men who could fight, who could intimidate, rose quickly through the ranks. Liam Steele Carter, the same man who'd dominated the East End streets, found himself behind bars at just 24. At first, he thought his reputation would protect him. But inside, reputations meant little. You had to prove yourself all over again. On his second day, a rival gang tried to test him. Liam fought back with a savagery that stunned even the veterans. By the end of that fight, he'd earned what every prisoner needed to survive: fear. Within months, Liam ran his wing like a general. He decided who got protection, who got punished, and who got peace. But ruling inside came at a cost. Every day was a war of nerves, enemies plotting, alliances shifting, guards watching. Sleep was a luxury. Trust was non-existent. Prison also became a place where these men connected. Fighters, gang leaders, and enforcers from all over Britain found themselves locked together, swapping stories, building alliances that would later shape the underworld outside. Some became lifelong partners in crime. Others became mortal enemies. But even in that chaos, there was a strange kind of respect. Among the hardest men, violence wasn't always about rage. It was about status. Beating the right man could make you untouchable. Losing could ruin you forever. It was an unspoken game where every punch carried meaning. The prisons themselves were like microcosms of the streets, full of politics, danger, and rules only the inmates understood. Contraband flowed like currency: tobacco, steroids, blades, and behind closed doors, deals were struck that reached far beyond the prison walls. By the late 1990s, prisons like Strangeways became infamous for their riots. Men like Big Tommy Clark used those moments to assert dominance, standing against guards and rival crews alike. Some riots lasted days, turning the prisons into war zones. Those who survived came out with scars, but also with new legends. For many, prison wasn't the end. It was the transformation. The weak broke down. The strong became harder, colder, more dangerous. By the time they were released, they weren't just criminals anymore. They were trained survivors. Men who'd learned to control their emotions, read danger instantly, and use fear as a weapon. Outside, their names carried even more weight. They were no longer street thugs. They were the men who'd conquered Britain's toughest prisons. And in the brutal logic of the underworld, that made them untouchable. But deep down, even they knew the truth. Every victory inside came with a price. And the real sentence wasn't the years they served. It was the darkness that stayed with them long after the gates opened. When Britain's toughest men walked out of prison, they didn't leave their world behind. They expanded it. The streets had changed, but the language of fear never went out of business. What once began with fists and street fights evolved into an empire built on intimidation, money, and control. Violence wasn't just survival anymore. It was strategy. These men understood power better than anyone. They realized fear could be monetized. Protection rackets, drug routes, underground fight clubs, and illegal casinos became the new battlefield. If someone owned a nightclub, a pub, or a shop, they paid for protection, not from outsiders, but from the same men offering it. Those who refused were taught a lesson they'd never forget. A broken window, a burned car, a midnight visit. The message was always the same: pay or disappear. Liam Steele Carter, hardened from years behind bars, turned his reputation into an industry. He opened a gym in East London, a front for laundering money and training new fighters who doubled as enforcers. His empire grew fast. Rival gangs either joined him or vanished. Fear was his best marketing tool. But this wasn't just about brute force anymore. Britain's underworld was evolving. Men like Big Tommy Clark partnered with Eastern European syndicates and Irish smugglers, expanding their operations internationally. Drugs flowed through ports, cash was cleaned through real estate, and violence became the shadow currency that kept everything running smoothly. To the public, they appeared as reformed men, giving interviews, writing books, even appearing in documentaries about their past lives. But behind the cameras, nothing had really changed. They still ran operations, still issued threats, still held entire neighborhoods in the palm of their hands. The business of violence thrived because fear worked. It always had. One act of brutality could control hundreds. A single rumor about what these men could do was enough to silence entire communities. Even the police often hesitated to interfere, knowing witnesses would never testify. But with money came greed, and greed brought cracks. Rivals from Liverpool and Birmingham began challenging their dominance, wanting a piece of the pie. The new generation wasn't bound by the old codes of loyalty or respect. They were reckless, armed, and unpredictable. Suddenly, the old guard, men like Carter and Clark, found themselves in a new kind of war. Gone were the days of fistfights and honor. Now it was guns, ambushes, and betrayal. The underworld had gone corporate, colder, faster, deadlier. To keep their grip, these older, hard men adapted. They became businessmen with criminal instincts, blending intimidation with investment. But deep down, they knew the truth. Every business built on fear eventually consumes itself. The moment people stop fearing you, your empire collapses. By the early 2000s, many of these men were either arrested, betrayed, or retired into quiet lives, ghosts of a violent era. Yet their influence remained. The gyms they built, the networks they started, the code they lived by, all continued under new names and new faces. Violence had become a legacy. It wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was a brand, one that could sell books, documentaries, and fame. But no matter how polished their public image became, their eyes told the truth. They were still the same men who had ruled Britain through fear. And in their silence lay the greatest secret of all. You can escape the streets, but you can never escape what the streets made you. For every legend born in Britain's underworld, there came a price, a heavy one. Behind the fame, the respect, and the fear, there was always a trail of broken lives. Being the toughest wasn't a gift. It was a curse that took everything and left nothing but ghosts. Liam Steele Carter had everything the streets could offer: money, reputation, and power. But by his mid-40s, the same empire that made him untouchable had turned into a prison without bars. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the men who once swore loyalty to him. Every friend felt like a potential traitor. Every shadow looked like a threat. His nights were sleepless, haunted by faces he'd hurt and enemies he couldn't forget. That was the truth for many of Britain's hardest men. Their power isolated them. Their families drifted away. Wives left, children grew up ashamed of their names, and the few who stayed loyal did so out of fear, not love. For years, these men had demanded respect. But deep down, all they ever wanted was peace. And peace was the one thing they could never buy. Big Tommy Clark spent his final years running a small bar in Glasgow, far from the chaos that once defined him. Locals still whispered his name, half in awe, half in fear. But the man himself was a shadow of who he'd been. Slower, quieter, tired. In one rare interview before his death, he said, "The streets gave me everything, and took it all back with interest." His words carried the weight of every fight, every scar, every man he'd buried. Some tried to change. A few turned to mentoring young fighters, teaching them discipline instead of destruction. Others found religion, speaking out against the same violence they once glorified. But no matter how far they ran from their past, it followed them like a shadow. Their toughness had defined them for so long that they no longer knew who they were without it. Many died violently, ambushed, betrayed, or consumed by the same paranoia they'd spread for years. Those who survived often found themselves alone, staring into empty rooms filled with trophies and regrets. The respect they'd built through fear now meant nothing. The world had moved on, and the code they lived by, loyalty, silence, violence, had become relics of a darker time. Yet, their legacy remains. Their names are still whispered in prisons, still told in pubs, still remembered by those who grew up under their reign. In some twisted way, they achieved what they always wanted: immortality through fear. But even that came with a cost. A lifetime of running from peace, trapped by the same power they once worshipped. In the end, Britain's toughest men weren't heroes or villains. They were products of their world, built by hardship, driven by pride, and destroyed by the very violence that made them. Their stories remind us that strength without mercy is just another form of weakness, and that real toughness isn't about how many people fear you, but how many you can protect without raising your fists. Their empires crumbled, their names faded, but their lesson remains. No one truly wins in the dark world of power, fear, and violence.